Good morning. Hey, morning. Welcome to the DeFi track. I want to start by saying a big thank you to the EthCC and Atheth teams for hosting the event. So I'm Dossa. I'm the head of technology at Polymath, and I'm also one of the ERC 1400 authors. So very briefly, Polymath is building and has deployed a mainnet, a on-chain protocol to allow anyone to issue and manage regulatory compliant security tokens. And I checked the stats last night. We've had 80, as of last night, we've had 80 organizations kind of come through and generate security tokens through the platform since we went live. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about what it means to model securities on public blockchains like Ethereum, where security tokens sort of fit into that modeling picture, and then the role of security tokens within the kind of decentralized or DeFi world, and what some of the challenges are in that process, and why the opportunity is so big and why it's so important to kind of win in this space. Okay. So in a kind of previous life, before I fell down the sort of crypto rabbit hole a few years ago, I spent the first sort of half of my career working at a large US sort of institutional trading firm on the technology team, and that role gave me a lot of kind of opportunity to think about what it means to model securities, what it means to value and assess the risk of securities in financial products. So the way I think about securities and modeling securities kind of fits into two somewhat distinct categories, shown up here. So one side is kind of inventory or inventory management, and that encompasses all of the sort of record keeping, managing the kind of legal ownership of securities, how they can be traded and transferred and settled between different parties, things like the kind of legal documentation and communication associated with owning securities. So that's the sort of inventory side. The other side, which is valuation. So if you're, as an individual or an organization, if you own some portfolio of assets, for sure you're going to be interested in understanding their value and their risk profile, how that value changes depending on different kind of market movements, market dynamics. That process will depend a lot on what the asset is. So maybe for a very liquid asset, you can just go to an exchange, you can get a price feed, multiply through by your position, and you're sort of done. But maybe for a more complex asset, something that's either a liquid or maybe has optionality or some sort of path-dependent derivative, you probably would have some sort of model-based valuation where you have a kind of black box model. It takes in various market dynamics, maybe FX rates or interest rate curves or vol surfaces, uses either some complex formula or maybe simulation pricing and spits out a value and risk. So those are the kind of the two areas that I think about when I think about modeling securities. Now, security tokens very much addresses the first half, so the left-hand side of the picture, the inventory side. Inventory management is, in my mind anyway, is a very natural fit for blockchains, particularly blockchains which are effectively kind of ledgers, are a natural fit for this type of record keeping. It gives you this sort of single source of truth, removes the requirements to do reconciliation. Obviously, with kind of programmable assets and smart contracts, you can do things like instant or instant-ish settlement. You can do atomic swaps, settlement in return for payment and so on. So security tokens kind of fits the left-hand side of the picture and is a pretty natural fit. On the valuation side, it's less obvious to me how you would leverage a blockchain directly. Valuations tend to be, your valuation model or risk models tend to be private, proprietary. So transparency here is not necessarily like something that people are looking for. Often they're very compute heavy, which for the kind of current generation of blockchains could be a bottleneck or be problematic. So valuation is kind of less obvious. There's a couple of categories which are sort of in the middle, which somewhat sit between the two areas, which I'll just touch on briefly. So liquidity is kind of interesting. So liquidity I guess traditionally you would think about it as being like some sort of like market feature, right? So you would go to, if you wanted to understand the liquidity of a stock, you would go to an exchange, you'd look at the order book, look at the depth of the order book, maybe look at the spread, look at how that's changed over time, and that would give you an idea of what the kind of liquidity of the stock was. In the DeFi world, there have been some really kind of interesting innovations recently, things like Uniswap, where which have introduced this kind of idea of like a liquidity pool or a decentralized liquidity or staking pool, which adds or then acts as an automated market maker for a stock. And even things like Stellar, where they, so the Stellar blockchain has, like at a base layer or layer 1, has integrated an order book into their blockchain. So some of these kind of DeFi approaches have started maybe to sort of shift the way that people think about liquidity and moved it more towards being kind of characteristic of the asset rather than something that's sort of fairly distinct. So liquidity is kind of interesting, it sits between the two. Cash flows is another area. So cash flows, by cash flows, I mean things like future payments of cash flows, things like dividends for an equity, or coupon payments for a bond, or interest rate payments for an interest rate swap, or whatever it is. So generally with cash flows, the kind of calculation of the amount that you're going to pay is likely to be done off-chain. If it's an equity, maybe it depends on the performance of the company and whatever other factors go into that, or maybe it depends on some calculation if it's a structured product. So the amount is likely to be calculated off-chain, but obviously the payment itself could easily be settled on-chain, and the kind of record keeping for that could happen on-chain. So cash flows and liquidity kind of sit in between. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus on security tokens, so mainly the left-hand side of the picture, which I think is kind of the most, maybe like the lowest hanging fruit in terms of blockchains and securities. Oops. Okay, so I want to spend a few minutes kind of giving my perspective on why I think security tokens are so relevant and so important. Decentralized finance has been this kind of standout success story for Ethereum over the last 12 months, maybe more. There are some stats I have which we'll probably hear repeated a little bit this week. So 2% of Ether is locked up in MakerDAO for CDPs, or collateral for CDPs to generate DAI. These stats I think I looked at last night, so they might be slightly out of date. So 20,000 Ether is locked up in Uniswap for liquidity pools. 28,000 Ether is locked up in the Compound protocol for lending. Stable coins have a total market cap of $2.5 billion. And you can, stable coins, I know that's obviously not just DAI, that's all stable coins. I know there's obviously some parts of that may be kind of controversial, but still is a massive market cap. And then last but not least, and it's something which is maybe sometimes kind of underappreciated, is that when you look across all public blockchains, there are daily millions of peer-to-peer transfers of value. You have individuals transacting value in a peer-to-peer fashion, which in my mind is definitely part of the kind of decentralized finance space. So, there's often like a lot of talk in Ethereum and these kind of conferences around, how do we drive adoption for blockchains or for Ethereum in particular? And to my mind, people think about a lot about what's the perfect product for blockchain, what's the best kind of product fit. To my mind, decentralized finance is kind of the answer, right? So it's something that you can only do with public blockchains. It doesn't really make sense outside of public blockchains. There are kind of immediate and obvious benefits to people to use decentralized financial products, things like being able to act as your own bank and borrow against your own collateral, as with kind of MakerDAO and so on. So it's a sort of standout success. Where there are some kind of limitations or issues is that today DeFi it's a little bit isolated and it's a little bit insular. So it's very good at dealing with assets, with on-chain assets. At the moment, that's primarily things like protocol tokens like Ether, or utility tokens. Obviously, DAI is out there as well as kind of synthetic sort of algorithmic stablecoin. But there's not really been much incorporation of like real-world assets into decentralized finance. So where I think security tokens sort of sit in this picture is they can act as a bridge between traditional finance and traditional financial assets and decentralized finance. And why is this, why is this good? So we can kind of think through some of the stakeholders. So if you're an advocate of public blockchains in general, then having sort of real-world assets sit alongside your protocol tokens, utility tokens, attracts the right kind of attention from regulators. It potentially attracts investment and capital from the kind of traditional world. For issuers of these assets, if you're issuing a security token or a security on-chain, it gives you access to these new forms of liquidity, which is, we talked about, but it's something I'm sort of super excited about. I think there's been a huge amount of innovation in the liquidity space. So Uniswap we talked about, things like DutchX, which introduce sort of auction-based mechanics for liquidity, things like 0x, AirSwap, Loopring, and the various other DEXs, which decentralize the kind of liquidity process. So there's been a huge amount of innovation, and it's something I'm sort of super excited about what the next 12 months is going to bring. As an issuer, it gives you access to these sort of new innovative liquidity approaches. It also, you can reduce costs, improve accessibility, improve your kind of reach in terms of capital, or gives you access to maybe finance you didn't used to have. For investors of these assets, so people who own these assets, again, it's fairly easy, fairly clear kind of benefits. You can, if you have an on-chain security, you can take that security and use it in decentralized financial protocols. So maybe you can add it to a multi-collateral CDP and borrow against it if you have short-term kind of cash flow requirements, or you can act as an automated market maker through something like Uniswap. So you have, it gives you, or lend it out on Compound or whatever it is, right? So it gives you all this other kind of feature sets that you get from on the decentralized financial side, you can use with your sort of real-world assets. And then last but not least, sort of importantly, what do regulators get from it? So regulators get this kind of unprecedented transparency, this immutable blockchain with well-crafted security tokens. The security token itself kind of embeds all the rules and regulations that pertain to that security token. So you have these kind of self-enforcing smart regulations. For regulators, it reduces this kind of need to sort of do after-the-fact auditing and investigation to check whether a security has been correctly traded, because those rules are enforced by the security itself. So there's a kind of hidden behind the image here, there's an image of the Golden Gate Bridge, and that's just meant to kind of emphasize this idea that security tokens are a sort of bridge between traditional finance and decentralized finance. Okay. So a kind of good question to ask when thinking about security tokens is why we wouldn't just use ERC20. So ERC20 is pretty ubiquitous. It's well understood. There's probably like thousands of implementations. It's been around, for I think since 2014, maybe 2015. And most DeFi protocols and exchanges and so on are kind of compatible with ERC20. And the answer is partially that we do, right? So every security token implementation that I've seen, whether it's Polymaths or any of the other ones I've seen out there, always start with ERC20 as a base and then layer on additional functionality. So all of these implementations are kind of backwards compatible with ERC20, which gives some advantages. But having said that, ERC20, which is great for utility tokens, there's some very kind of clear gaps where it doesn't cleanly model the types of characteristics which are native to security. So there are these kind of gaps between what ERC20 can do and really what we need to be able to cleanly model securities and be able to kind of interoperate with them in a kind of consistent way. And I'm going to go through some of those gaps in a moment. And these gaps are really, form the kind of basis of what the ERC 1400, this kind of library of security token standards is. I'll talk a bit more about that at the end. So the first one is verifying transfers. So ERC20 has this kind of basic assumption that if you have a kind of sufficient balance of ERC20 tokens, you will be able to transfer them to another address. With securities, this assumption just doesn't hold. So there's kind of like a whole host of transfer restrictions that apply to securities. to give you a kind of flavor of what some of those are, some of the ones we've implemented at Polymath. So we have is a kind of basic one that every investor must go through some sort of KYC, AML verification. Some securities have a cap on the total number of investors, so maybe you're only allowed to have 1,000 investors in total. Some securities cap the maximum individual percentage ownership that a single investor can have, so the maximum that a single investor can own of the asset. Almost certainly securities have some sort of lock-up period which restricts secondary trading, and there are some more kind of sophisticated transfer restrictions. So some securities have rolling volume restrictions, so you're only allowed to trade either individually or in aggregate a certain amount of volume, say per rolling 90 days or something. So there's a whole host of reasons why it may not be possible to either purchase or transfer securities that you own. So what 1400 does, what ERC 1400 does, is it gives a kind of clean interface to be able to check whether a transfer is or isn't valid. And importantly, if it's not valid, give you some sort of indication or status code as to why that transfer is not valid. And for that last bit, we leverage ERC 1066, which is a ERC or EIP which introduces Ethereum status codes or error status codes, which we leverage for that bit. Okay. Okay, so the next section is, or the next gap is issuance and redemption. So issuance and redemption broadly maps to the concepts of minting and burning, probably more commonly used with ERC20. So ERC20 doesn't really have a lot to say about the way that tokens are created and destroyed. Typically, the ICO contract would have some rules in it around how tokens are minted, and maybe the token contract would have some rules in it around how tokens can be burnt, or sometimes people burn tokens just by sending them to a sort of dead address or something. For securities, obviously, issuance and redemption are kind of like first-class economic activities. So it's important to have clear semantics around them, and 1400 introduces relatively simple but kind of clear semantics around issuance and redemption. So obviously issuance is fairly obvious. Redemption, so for example, if you have a fund and you have a tokenized fund, perhaps you allow owners of your token to redeem them or burn them in return for some proportional value of the fund at the point when the tokens are burnt. And it's, the clear semantics means that things like block explorers or wallets or exchanges can obviously kind of scan through the events and get a very clear picture or economic picture of when the security is being created or issued and destroyed. Okay. So the next section is partitioned balances. So ERC20 models fungible tokens. So my ERC20 token should be the same as everyone else's ERC20 token. And that's true for securities as well, right? So if I have an Apple stock, that should be equivalent in value and kind of use to somebody else's Apple stock. Where that breaks down a little bit is my ownership or transfer restrictions on my shares or securities are not necessarily fungible. So to give a kind of concrete example, suppose that I bought 20 shares of a particular company during the primary issuance or the STO process. And those shares are locked, say, for 12 months for secondary trading purposes. And I then bought an additional 30 shares of the same company on a secondary market, perhaps in a different jurisdiction. So, and those shares are unlocked. So I now have a total balance of 50 shares, of which 20 are locked and 30 are unlocked. So the way 1400 deals with this is it introduces this as a kind of first order concept, partitions. So your balance of 50 is now partitioned into two sort of sub-balances, one of 20, one of 30, and 1400 kind of gives like an interface for how you query, get a list of the partitions of your balance, how you can query the balance of your token by partition and operate on your token partitions directly. So it gives a lot more kind of transparency and control and kind of understanding or breakdown of your balance and the transfer restrictions that apply to it relative to ERC20. Okay. So this controller operations is kind of an interesting one. It's one that in general with security tokens, there's often a little bit of tension between, I guess, kind of blockchain-centric, decentralized ethos and maybe the more kind of pragmatic or real-world or kind of regulatory-orientated approach that has to underpin securities. And this is probably one area that particularly shows that up. So securities are generally not bearer instruments, right? So if I own a security and I lose my private key, or there's some sort of fraud, or perhaps if I die and that I want those assets to be inherited or passed down, but I haven't sort of passed my private key down, then there has to be some way of dealing with that situation, right? So with utility tokens, generally there isn't, right? And the internet or Reddit or whatever, right, is littered with instances of people effectively losing their utility tokens by sending them to the wrong address or losing their private key or some sort of fraud type activity. That doesn't really, can't really happen with securities. So the way 1400 addresses this is we introduce this kind of concept of there being a controller actor or controller entity. That controller entity can have all sorts of, it can be a multi-sig, can have whatever governance around it you want there to be, but can effectively arbitrarily transfer tokens between addresses. It can't issue new tokens, it can't redeem tokens, but it can, keeping the total supply the same, it can make arbitrary token transfers. So, definitely that is a centralized point of control. So so 1400 introduces this concept. It means, even though you have this centralized control, you still have transparency. So as a, say, investor or whatever in the security, you can see exactly whether this power has been used, under what circumstances it's been used. And 1400 also has the ability for an issuer to kind of disavow this permission, so permanently disavow it. So if you want to, if it's not appropriate for your particular use case, or you want to have this sort of more, less centralized, more decentralized approach, you can, set a switch which permanently and irrevocably sort of revokes this actor or removes this actor. Okay. So real-world data is another interesting one. We talked a lot about the fact that securities often have these kind of very complex transfer restrictions, maybe depend on very kind of complex business logic and data and state and different entities interacting. And whilst it is possible to model a lot of that on-chain using on-chain smart contracts or logic, on-chain data and so on and so forth, it may be quite burdensome to model all of that on-chain. Kind of simple example which illustrates that is if suppose you're an exchange and you've KYC'd and onboarded a new investor, and that investor wants to buy some security. In order to purchase that security, the exchange will typically have to make 2 transactions. They'll have to send one transaction to add the investor to a whitelist, and then a second transaction to actually transfer securities to that investor. That kind of leads to a pretty bad UX, and you have to submit 2 transactions. Obviously, there's like a gas cost. You have to manage those transactions. There's a sort of speed impact and so on. So what ERC 1400 aims to do is kind of future-proof itself, and for the transfer, issuance, and redemption functions in ERC 1400, we introduce this sort of new parameter, which is it's like a bytes data variable, so sort of data blob that can be passed alongside the transfer, issuance, or redemption. And typically that data blob would contain something like a signed authorization or signed authorization from an authorized entity. So in the exchange case we just talked about, rather than there needing to be 2 separate transactions, the exchange could make one single transfer transaction, but pass along with that transfer some signed KYC data for the investor, and in that single transaction, the investor can be whitelisted and receive their tokens. Obviously, to do that, the exchange would have to be like an authorized signer, given the sort of permission or ability to do that by the issuer. And there's all sorts of other use cases for, particularly for exchanges and brokers and so on. If you're a broker and you want to give someone permission to transact a particular security, rather than doing that on-chain, you can instead just give them off-chain, a signed bit of data, maybe with an expiry date or something, which the investor can then self-submit when they go to purchase those tokens. So, there's really no upfront cost to introducing these kind of data blobs through the spec, but we think it does a lot in terms of future-proofing and kind of keeping options open for future use cases. Okay, and the last one is document management. So this is probably the kind of least sexy of the six, but securities come with all sorts of legal documentation that's associated with them and needs to be attached to them. 1400 has fairly simple kind of structure for attaching, updating, notarizing, and communicating document-based updates to the security token. I should say fairly obviously the documentation itself is not stored on chain, so you store like a URI to the document, which could be either a pointer to a web page or could be something on IPFS. And you can optionally kind of notarize the document, so you can include a hash of the content if you want to. It's optional, and then that would obviously give you a kind of notarization ability. And every time a document is attached or updated, certain events are fired, which you could use as a kind of backbone or to trigger off-chain communications, emails, and so on and so forth. So those are the kind of six sort of major gaps that we see between ERC20 and what's needed for securities. And those are the gaps effectively which ERC 1400 aims to address as of today. So I want to talk a little bit at a kind of meta level about ERC 1400 and the kind of process and approach and the way we've sort of approached the analysis and the iteration involved. So the first thing to say is that we've tried, so the process of kind of crafting ERC 1400 has been this huge collaborative effort. So it's not just like a polymath effort. There's been countless companies and organizations, individuals involved. It's been a long-running process. It's been a very iterative process, and at kind of every stage we've tried to be as transparent and as collaborative and kind of consensus-driven as possible. So before making any kind of changes or updates to the spec, we've tried to achieve this sort of rough consensus. In practice, the things we've done is we've run 2 security token rings at Ethereum Magician Councils here and in Paris. Here and in Berlin, rather. At Prague, rather, at DEF CON. We've done community calls, all of the online discussion happens in open channels, so we use the Ethereum Magicians forum, GitHub, obviously, so the issue on GitHub, or the main issue, has well over 100 comments. There's a Telegram channel, there's a web page. We obviously try and put out Medium articles explaining changes and so on, and obviously do talks like this. So there's been this kind of big focus around transparency and collaboration, which makes sense for a standard because it has to be a kind of industry-wide consensus. Otherwise, there's not that much point. The second thing to mention is that ERC 1400 is a little unusual in that it's a library of standards. So there's a kind of core security token standard, which every 1400 token would need to implement. And then there's a series of additional substandards, which are all interoperable with the core standard and all interoperable with each other. So you can kind of flexibly compose them to meet whatever your specific use case based on your particular asset or jurisdiction. The reason for that, and that came out of a lot of conversation with the community. The reason for that was it's a decent balance between needing a good degree of consistency across different security tokens, and also giving people the flexibility to not have to implement a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't make sense for them, and kind of craft exactly what they need for their particular use case. So those are, and then the last thing I guess is that we try to be as sort of unopinionated as possible in areas that weren't related to security. So the 1400 standards are all kind of laser focused purely on the interface and not the implementation. So we try to be as kind of unopinionated as possible about the implementation. Like an example of this is that you can use ERC 1400 with either an ERC 20 token or an ERC 777 token as the base. And I think one of the implementations, I think the consensus implementation actually uses ERC 777, and then other implementations use ERC 20. So we try to have this kind of interface-first, unopinionated approach. And then I guess one last thing that's worth just maybe restating is that why are standards so important, particularly for decentralized finance, where decentralized finance protocols generally resolve to there being some smart contract or series of smart contracts that have to interoperate with assets and do clever things, whether it's make a DAO or Uniswap or whatever. In order to do that with real-world securities, these securities have to conform to some consistent standard. Otherwise, you end up needing like 5 different copies of the MakerDAO smart contracts to deal with different types of security tokens. So standards, and in some sense, it doesn't matter. Like the kind of details of the standard can be argued about whether whether a function has one name or another name is not so important, but having a consistent standard is important and helps kind of drive, helps us with interoperability with decentralized finance, which I think is a kind of win-win situation. Let's go this way. So this is a kind of quick slide. So there's a whole bunch of people working on 1400 implementations, and these are just some of them. So there's a reference implementation, which is on the EIP spec GitHub, I think, which is obviously open source, and anyone can take and use or build on top of, et cetera, et cetera. So Polymath, the company I work for, has an implementation which is just about to go for audit, and is our sort of 3.0 release of the protocol. Consensus has an implementation which you can see there. Deeper Tech is working on quite a novel kind of approach to implementing ERC 1400. And there's a bunch of other organizations and companies, in various different places across the world working on implementation. So, so exactly the same as ERC 20, that the expectation is not that there's some, that there's like a single implementation. The expectation is that you have a single standard and multiple implementations that kind of conform to that standard. Okay. So this is the last slide. So I wanted to just talk about a few areas which are maybe a little bit thought-provoking and are not covered by the 1400 spec as it exists today. And this, the 1400, as I say, it's like a library of standards. The expectation is that over time, new sort of features or substandards are added to that library. So there's a few areas here. We talked a little bit about liquidity and capital distribution already. Some other interesting areas, so confidential transfers is something that comes up. So we spend a lot of time at Polymath talking to people like institutional investors and trading desks and so on. Confidential transactions is something that comes up. It's obviously like the flip side of the sort of transparency of a blockchain is that if you're a large institutional investor and you want to make some very large trade or something, you may not want that. You may not want the price you paid for it to be entirely transparent. So you might want all the kind of convenience and benefits of a blockchain in terms of instant settlement and that type of thing, but without necessarily every bit of data about the transfer being public. So confidential transfers, which typically use some form of, zero knowledge proof or homomorphic encryption, are it's a really interesting area kind of cryptographically, and it's an area obviously there's a whole bunch of companies, organizations working on in the Ethereum space and outside of Ethereum, and obviously allow you to obfuscate sort of certain details of the transfer. I want to give a shout out. There's a company called Aztec, who I think presenting sometime this week, who deployed on mainnet a kind of proof of concept confidential wrapper, and we put through actually a Polymath token through their kind of confidential wrapper and did some confidential transfers of a security token through their wrapper. And they've published a couple of EIPs recently, so that's worth checking out. And then the other area that's kind of interesting, which is not covered by 1400, is pooled wallets. So pooled wallets are where you take assets from a whole bunch of investors and you pull them together into a single smart contract. So you see this happening in some DEXs. You see it happening often in centralized exchanges. You also see it for Plasma contracts, for the entry and exit mainnet contract for Plasma. And it has some issues with security tokens. So some of the issues are it kind of impacts governance and capital distribution. So if you've pooled everyone's assets and you want to distribute a dividend, that dividend goes to the smart contract that holds those assets, not to the kind of underlying beneficial owners. And in the reverse direction, if you're, let's say you're holding some governance vote, it's technically the smart contract that holds all of the investors' assets that has the ability to vote rather than the underlying beneficial owners. So it breaks kind of capital distribution and governance. And there's one other issue which is kind of related to controller operations, which is that if a controller force transfers some assets out of a pooled wallet, then effectively that pooled wallet becomes insolvent or partially insolvent, or like a fractional reserve, and you would probably have some sort of race to exit type problem, which would obviously be problematic. So exactly how pooled wallets and securities sort of need to interact or interoperate is something where there's a whole bunch of kind of interesting conversations going on online. So yeah, I'll end there, and I just wanted to encourage anyone who's interested in the area to hop online. On the next slide, there's a web page which has links to the Telegram, has links to the GitHub, has links to everything you kind of need to kind of get involved in the conversation and start contributing. And I'm sure there are lots of other areas as well which people want to talk about and get involved with. So thank you very much. And I don't know if we have time for questions or...
Thanks, and thanks very much. That was very informative. Just would like to get some further thoughts from you on the confidential transactions or the confidentiality piece. How much of a blocker do you think it is for full adoption of tokens on public blockchains? It seems to me, especially from an institutional perspective, that this is something that is very important. And so I'm just curious to see how you really see that progressing, given the nascency of some of the privacy technologies and techniques.
Yeah, I think so it's a super interesting area, confidential transfers, and it's something, which is, it's exciting that we can now do confidential transfers on the Ethereum mainnet. Obviously, there have been things like Zcash and stuff like that around for a while, kind of. And other ones as well. In terms of how much of a blocker it is, the impression I get is that it's not the main blocker at the moment, if you like. So it is primarily an issue where you have large institutional trading firms, and I guess some of the reasons for that is that, as of today, right, with utility token trading, where there's basically no confidential trading, doesn't seem to bother. Probably most people trading utility tokens are like individuals, right? It doesn't really bother people because you already have some confidentiality anyway. You have pseudo-anonymous addresses and things of that nature. You could potentially split your tokens across multiple addresses and so on. But I think if you're going to look forward to where security tokens are widely adopted and being used by large institutional firms, they're unlikely, the pseudo-anonymity of addresses is probably going to be quite easy to break because, through things like chain analysis and stuff like that. And they're also much more susceptible. If you're Goldman Sachs, right, and you know Morgan Stanley's trading position as an adversary, if you want to be adversarial, you could probably put pressure on them. You could kind of exploit that knowledge one way or another. And so those sort of firms are obviously very defensive around that. So I think it's a blocker to get to adoption by these sort of larger institutions, but it's probably not the most immediate blocker. If you're talking about smaller private placements and stuff like that, where investors tend to be more like kind of individuals than larger firms.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. I was wondering, exchanges like Nasdaq and other exchanges have really extensive ways to make sure that they will be around for at least the next 10 years or so. Those currently do not exist in public blockchains. Well, I hope at least all the people in this room think Ethereum will be around in the next 10 years, but I bet you a lot of investors don't believe that. How do you look at this?
So you mean the kind of longevity of organizations working in the blockchain space, you mean, or?
Yeah, well, more about the longevity of the chain itself.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely true that working on a public blockchain has pros and cons, right? So I'm obviously a huge fan of Ethereum and public blockchains in general, but some of the concerns when we talk, and again, these concerns tend to come from like the larger, maybe more risk-adverse, conservative sort of companies. Forking is definitely something that gets raised lots, right? If you have a contentious fork of some sort, which it would probably be silly to rule out, given that it's clearly happened in the past, right? There's obviously some chance that can happen. If you have a contentious fork, then obviously you have something to deal with, right? Because the company itself doesn't fork, right? So you'd have to have people sort of choosing one side or the other, which becomes like a political or a technical statement. And probably companies who want to issue security tokens, that's not really what they're in it for, right? Is to weigh in some political debate about a blockchain fork. So that's forking is definitely an issue. As you say, like things like longevity of maybe a chain, blockchains haven't been around that long, right? I think it was the 10-year anniversary of Bitcoin last year, I think, and Ethereum is obviously much younger than that. These are definitely all concerns that get raised. At the same time, and particularly by kind of larger risk-adverse firms, I guess my kind of comment on those is, I mean, it's an emerging area, it's an emerging technology. We're all sort of still learning as a community about how to deal with these sorts of things and how to have better governance and all these sorts of things. Ultimately, it is possible to move securities between blockchains. Let's say the blockchain you issued your security on blew up for some reason, right, or had some issue like that. You could, in a sort of centralized fashion, move your securities to a different blockchain if you wanted to. There'll potentially be a kind of complex operational process to do that. But yeah, I mean, they're definitely valid concerns that we do here.
Hello. Are you working with traditional clearing firms right now, or are they giving you a lot of pushback with these standards? So like Apex Clearing, have you contacted them to see if they can help out with this process, or are they kind of just shutting it down and
you mean particularly on the kind of standard side?
Yep.
I mean, most of the companies we're working with, and we have talked to like larger, more traditional companies, there it's been more like a educational exercise, I guess you could say, like us trying to educate them on why we think standards are important, sort of what the standard encompasses and so on, as opposed to like a more interactive thing. But we have taken some of their feedback, particularly some of the larger brokers, we have taken some of their feedback and incorporated it. But most of the companies and organizations and individuals working actively, you could say, are probably more like companies like Polymath and our competitors on the issuance side, or KYC providers, transfer agents, exchanges, like sort of blockchain or exchanges working in the crypto world, and companies of that. And we also have had lots of discussions with regulators and lawyers and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, at like a technical level, we probably had most detailed collaboration with people who are more familiar with the space, and the other conversations tend to be a bit more one way.
I don't know if I'm pushing in. So where do the documents live, or if you've got something like the shareholder details, obviously that's not on chain in plain text format, where does that live?
So the way document management works in 1400 is that you store on chain a URI. It's like that could be either a URL, like a web page, or it could be like an IPFS location or something of that nature. So you're not storing the document on chain, right? You're just storing the location of it. And you can also optionally store a hash of the content of the document if you want to kind of formally like notarize it on the blockchain.
Okay, great, thanks.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for your time. I was just wondering if you, curious as to who are the main competitors or alternatives to 1400 as a single standard?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there are definitely, you can obviously go to kind of GitHub and have a look. There are other standards kind of covering a similar area. I'm not going to try to remember all the numbers now, but yeah, I mean there are a bunch out there, and you can have a look, and some people. So Stefan Goslin, I'm not sure if he's in the room or not, but I know he's talking later on today. Has done like a lot of analysis between the kind of different standards, and I guess I mean so there are other ones out there. I don't want to kind of stand here and sort of say, well, 1400 is better because these reasons, seems
Gotcha.
a little unfair, right? But take a look at them and obviously make your own minds up. And so the approach with 1400 has always tried to be relatively general. So some of the other standards are maybe more use case specific. Some of them have some features but not other features, and so on and so forth. But yeah.
Understood. Thanks.
So just sidetracking from the technical bits. Something that I see, regulators really need to be educated on this technology, and that is something which I think is lacking right now. So what efforts is Polymath doing to sort of combat that and bring regulators, whether it's the SEC or the FCA or wherever jurisdiction it is, on board early to understand the technology happening here, and then giving the nod to larger institutions like Goldman Sachs, etc., to adopt this, because otherwise it's a great exercise in time wasting. Yeah,
I mean, it's a good point. I think, as you say, like regulators are the key stakeholder in this area, right? I mean, so what we're doing at Polymath, so there's a few like consortium industry groups. There's a group called Dossa, DASA, who are presenting to regulators, I think, later on this month. And that's a consortium, right? So it's like 10 members, of which, or maybe more than that, of which we're one. We talk to Canadian regulators directly. So Polymath is a Canadian company. I've talked to UK regulators. I mean, these kind of discussions, as you say, tend to be more educational than anything else, right? Regulators, and I love regulators, but they're not known for their very fast decision making. So the feeling is that it's mainly around education. It's mainly about sort of chipping away, trying to explain. Something I feel strongly is that this type of technology has a huge benefit to regulators, right? I feel like there's an uphill battle, and if you like, the ICO kind of excitement that happened in 2017, summer 2018, probably put regulators on the back foot a little bit, because you had all this unregulated activity, for better or worse. But putting that aside, I think security tokens should be a massive benefit for regulators. Public blockchain should be something they do embrace, and I think they will get there. Regulators obviously are not a single entity. There's different voices, but we hear plenty of positive, plenty of ambitious thinking coming out of regulators, along with notes of caution, particularly on the consumer protection side, where there's a lot of caution, probably rightly so, given all the kind of inherent dangers and risks involved in crypto land.
Thank you very much for nice talk. One question, so next 2 years, like it's more from your perspective. We're talking about the security tokens or about the tokenized securities. Which one you choose? Better for you.
So I think security tokens are like the thin end of the wedge, right? I think security tokens make a ton of sense. It's a great use case. It's something we can tackle today with current, let's say scalability and things that are available on public blockchains today. in like 2 years or 5 years, 10 years, right, I feel like there's a huge amount of additional stuff you could do on blockchains, whether it's, you know, exciting, innovative, decentralized, derivative type contracts where everything is automated on chain, where you can do a lot of cool and kind of crazy stuff like that. And I think, you know, I think once you get a kind of snowball effect going, you'll see a lot of this innovation. We're already seeing a lot of this innovation happening today, right? But I think this kind of innovation is going to continue to grow and grow. Hopefully, as more and more people get attracted to the space, and you know, whether it's capital investment and people and so on. So, in the longer term, you know, I think there's all sorts of crazy, cool stuff you can happen. But security tokens is definitely the, I say, it's like the thin end of the wedge. It's what we can do today. It makes sense. It kind of allows us to start moving real-world assets into decentralized financial protocols, which I think is useful. Yeah, I'm not sure if that was.
Thank you.
Okay.
So we will have to move on as we are late on the schedule.
Thank you very much.